Okay, this is an update on the French door project, and I do have the door already in the door frame. I didn't have enough hands to film actually putting it in. I know that might have been exciting, but I just wanted to go over the steps just to let you know any issues that I might have had. So from where I had left off, the next step would have been to tape the corners. That, of course, was quite easy, no problem. Didn't run into any issue. Next issue was to apply the caulk around the two sides, the top, and across the sill. And that did not turn out to be a problem. Ultimately, I did pick up some of the Andersen sealant, window and door installation sealant at the hardware store. It was not terribly expensive at Home Depot, not much more really than just a tube of caulk. So I don't know exactly what type of material it is, but I went ahead with it. Now, it turns out it does tend to be very thick compared to some other caulks. So it was hard to apply in terms of the force required. And the style of this particular caulk is you have to take this nozzle off and cut it. Then you have to puncture a foil seal. I usually puncture the foil seal with this rod on the side of the caulk gun. And initially I only pierced it one time, and the caulk was coming out very slow. Not consistent with what I was expecting based on having seen a video online where they were applying the caulk. So I went ahead and punctured it several more times, and I eventually got it flowing. And I was able to apply quite a bit of caulk, possibly too much, since I did have quite a bit of squeeze out. But it says a 3/8 inch bead. Anyway, I thought that's what I had, but anyway, the next step, according to this, now at this point they're showing the door out of the packaging material and vertical. So I still had my door in its original packing box. So after transporting it to the site, putting it vertical, I then get to this step where it says to lock the doors. You would have thought the doors would have been locked in the packing case, but apparently they weren't, and maybe there's a reason for that. The doors do come in the packing case with these spacers, you might call them. They had these orange spacers on the bottom, and they had these at the corners of the two doors. And I guess the idea is so that the doors are held in place with support. But in our case, several of these had actually fallen out by the time we got around to transporting the box to this location. And we felt that the patio doors were actually swinging open inside the box as we were transporting it to this location. And they were actually doing that, and they shouldn't have been, but I didn't want to open the box up until we got actually to the installation site, and it didn't seem to be a problem because we carried the box somewhat carefully. Now when we got to the installation site, these spacers were still intact, or actually one of them was, and the other one was actually loose in the box, and I didn't even notice it at first. These, one or two of these had actually fallen out. I thought as packing material I would just remove them. Well, I shouldn't have removed them. I should have left them in because it helps to keep the doors in position. And we got to the step where we were to lock the door, and here's where a slight complication, because the directions that they're showing here are for the right side door, and this corresponds to the case where the right side of the door is active and the left is passive. And it turned out I had ordered it in the reverse direction. So anyway, these instructions wouldn't apply to what I was doing. At first I was trying to turn these in the wrong direction, but after figuring that out, the door still would not lock properly because the spacers were out and the locking bar was not aligning in the not in this slot here necessarily, but on the sides of the doors. There's also slots for a locking bar to engage. Eventually, we were able to get the doors into position and lock them, but it was difficult. And it wasn't actually until the door was in the frame that we actually got them into the locking position. Fully locked. There's actually two ways to lock it here. One here and one here. One of them we were able to lock like on a deadbolt, but the other one, which would have put the lock pin through here, there wasn't enough tolerance for it to get in because the doors were not, they didn't have help in centering them with these guides. So it was a complication, but I don't think anything got damaged. Okay, now the next step was to remove these handling straps on the two sides. That was not a problem. They went on. Next step was to snap out the installation flange. The installation flange at first did not appear to snap. We folded it out, and after playing with it for quite a while, I just realized that it does take quite a bit of force to get it to snap. But once you do get it to snap, then you realize that you do need to apply more force in all around, and it eventually did snap in all the way around. The next step here is to apply these corner gaskets and then to apply caulk at the corner parts. Apparently right in that corner is probably what they're concerned about, there being a weakness in the frame. So I did apply that. That did not seem to be a problem. Here, just to kind of show you, up there I might have had too much caulk overall, but I don't think it's going to be a problem. The next step was to place this door in the patio opening. Now, it says center it, but we didn't really take any special precaution of centering it. We had 3 people total. My brother-in-law happened to be visiting, so he was on one side, I was on the other side, and my wife was supporting the back side as we lifted it up. And 3 people was certainly enough. 2 people would have been okay. Now, as I said, we didn't pay any particular attention to centering it, and it did end up being reasonably well centered. And I'll show you from the inside, because you can't see that from the outside how well centered it was. It could have been better if I had marked the center of the threshold and the center of the sill. So as we were approaching it from the 2 sides, the problem is when each person approaches it from the 2 sides, they can't tell if the gap on their side is going to equal the gap on the other side. The difference between the rough opening and the width of the door frame is 3/4 of an inch. Ideally, you'd want 3/8 of an inch on either side. In this particular case, instead of ending up with 3/8 and 3/8, we probably ended up with 2/8 and 4/8. Okay, it was probably like that. Not terrible, but it probably could have been better if we had done a little bit more work trying to center it, but I wasn't thinking about centering it, I was just thinking about getting it in. Okay, this only applies to storm watch door, and that doesn't apply to us. The next step here is the shimming procedure. Is it? Yes. Shims, that's right, installing the shims. Now, I thought the shims would come with the pack, but they didn't. There were no shims. So I went to the hardware store, and I did get the shims. I got this type which, when I saw a video for installation, it looks like they were using this type of shim. Looks like a horseshoe. And the idea is that each of these shims is a 1/16 of an inch, and you simply stack them up until you get the correct thickness. So your tolerance is going to be to within a 1/16 of an inch. It won't necessarily be perfectly snug. It could be a little bit loose because you can't get an extra 1/16 of an inch shim in there, or it'll be a little bit tight, but you do the best you can. And it mentions here that the shims must be tight to the installation flange and recessed 3/8 of an inch, and they have a diagram showing the recess. But it's not really clear from this diagram if it's to be recessed from the door frame or from the stud in the rough opening. And the reason is because they show these in an incorrect order. The door frame actually extends further out than the stud. The stud is in because there's room for the wallboard to fit against the installation trim. So when they say recessed, it's really kind of vague. Now the way these shims work, there are 1/2 inch increments that you snap off in order to get the correct depth. If I snapped off one, that would just fit the 4.5 inch or so width, okay, of that opening. But I snapped off 2 because I wanted to create the recess, and I didn't want to take any chances with what they were saying. Okay, and this is just, I'll show you an example. Okay, here's one where the shim is in place. You can see the numbers. In this case, it's 6. Okay, that would be 3/8. That one is the nominal spacing, so that's an example of how it did end up centered reasonably well. Now, and they're recessed in. I snapped off 2 of the tabs, so they're now well inside of here. This may be unnecessary. I don't know. I assume that the only purpose of the recess is so that the wallboard, won't bump into it, but it doesn't really have to be recessed for that purpose. Anyway, it turned out the door ended up reasonably plumb and level according to the 4-foot level, without any real special shimming procedure. In other words, the shims were simply designed to fill in the gaps. But we did have people leaning on the door frame from the outside because it did want to sit a little bit pushing out. In other words, the flange, it wanted initially to sit that way. And then after having someone pushing that whole side up against it, over a period of time, it actually stopped wanting to lean out. It was probably settling in, I suppose, on the caulk. And as it settled down in on the caulk, it seemed as though it did take a more stable position, which was more closer to square than to what we wanted. So it turned out to be, I think, okay that way. Now, it says here to shim behind each hinge and fastener hole. Now, shimming behind the fastener holes is relatively easy because you can take a fastener hole, you can put a 3-inch screw through it, you can then go to where that screw is and you can slide the horseshoe shim around where that would be, okay, holding that shim in place. What I did on this was I took a stack of shims and I would put it underneath where I actually wanted the shims to be, so that the shims would not fall down. In other words, it gives them a shelf to slide in on until I got the screw all the way in, okay? And then I would take some other shims, for example, and I would use those to push the shim in until it hit the installation flange on the front. I wanted it all the way in, okay? Then I would go and tighten the screw, okay, after doing that. Now, we did check the diagonal on the outside, and it was within 1/8 of an inch. Okay, even though the rough opening was not within 1/8 of an inch, but because this sat flat on the floor, the frame of the door frame was within 1/8 of an inch. So even though the rough opening was not, it seemed okay. Now the next step was to fasten the door through the installation holes, and I did run into a problem here, and that is the 3-inch screw, in many cases, would not go all the way in. It just was too tight. Okay, and I've seen that happen before, in putting a 3-inch screw into 3 inches of 2x4. It binds up before it gets in, and then the screw head starts to thread out. After running into some trouble, I realized, okay, even though it doesn't say it in the installation, I'm going to drill pilot holes. So I backed out all the screws and I drilled pilot holes and I put them back in. And for the most part, everything worked fine, with the exception of one of them, the screw broke, and that one was stuck. So in this case, in this location, this one has 4 installation screws on each side, okay? And one of them is not effective, okay? Because of that problem. But if you see where that is around the front here, you'll see that I've already started putting the screws in for the hinges, and it turns out that that is right in the exact location where there's going to be 2 3-inch screws from the hinge anyway. So what I have here is I put the shims in behind where these, it turns out the hinge screws are too close to the front to use the horseshoe to go around the screw. It would stick out too much. So I just slid it in right next to the screw. Okay, it doesn't surround the screw. There's very little space in front of that screw, actually. Okay, so for any sort of recess, you can't have a shim closer this way. So that's the problem I ran into on that. Now I think it's okay because I have 2 3-inch screws here, and this one here is simply, the screw is in the hole, but it's not tight. So it's not, I call it not effective. It's not really doing much. Okay, and I'm at the point now, so I did run into a problem with that step on the drills. I should have pre-drilled them right off the bat, but I didn't. Okay, now I got to the point where I was able to open the patio doors, which I have right now, and then of course it says to take out the spacers. Some of the spacers had already, well, actually, for the ones that had fallen out, I had put them back in because I realized after a time that we needed the spacers back. So we actually opened the doors and put the spacers back in around the corners as well as on the sill to get the doors back supported. Okay, so we kind of recovered on that account. And the step that I'm doing right now is drilling the hinge screws, okay? And I'm pre-drilling in all cases. Here's an example where I just put in 2 of them, okay? And you can see that in this case, I've got one of that shim pack right behind and centered on those 2 screws, okay? That's just because that's the width of it. You can see that I'm not terribly happy with all the quality here, because here's an example where I didn't pre-drill those. Those were already drilled. They came this way. And that's, I'm going to pre-drill those a second time through the door frame because it's just too far off. Okay? Some of the other ones are not that far off. Okay, but they're still not centered. Okay, and that screw, when it goes through, I probably can't really drill another one. I'm going to have to go with that one and then wait for the screw to finally pull in center when it gets to the very end. Okay? That's not ideal, but it'll work. Okay? The ones on the bottom I think look better, but they're still off-centered. So nothing's perfect, okay, but it's working out. Now, I should mention this. When I went to the online installation video that I found that showed an Andersen dealer applying it, when they put the screws on the top, they did not apply the shims in that location. They said to put the shims in, okay, in that gap, put the installation screw in, and then take the shims out. They did not want, for some reason, they were concerned with some issues regarding flexing of the top. So right now, those screws are in snug, but there's no shim up there, just based entirely on that one video. I could put shims in there. In theory, I could even loosen those installation screws if I needed to. Okay. And put shims and tighten them up again, but I have them there the way that it did show in the video. So anyway, I'm at the point now of putting in the rest of these screws, okay? And then at that point I can move on to some of this other hardware. So this video kind of went on longer than I like, but it does show some of the problems that I did have, but nothing that we weren't able to overcome here. And it looks like probably the installation is going to be okay.